Again, my name is Brett Farley. I'm the Executive Director of the Catholic Conference of Oklahoma. That is not an event. I just want to make sure everybody's clear. I get calls sometimes, when is that? It's not a when, it's a what. We're an organization, and so as Catholics, we like to use words as they were originally intended, so it's the act of conferring, i.e. the bishops confer with each other. The shorthand version of that is I'm the lobbyist for the bishops, so if you just think of that, then it's easy. So the church obviously has a little bit of interest in what's going on at the state capitol and in the national capital, and so to do that, they've got to have folks that are on the ground representing the church and acting as the voice of the bishops in everything that goes on legislatively. And so that's my job here in Oklahoma. So from February to May, when the state legislative session is in session, my job is to go to the Capitol and just represent the church's interest. And so, as you might imagine, that encompasses things like the sanctity of life, abortion, religious freedom, family law, and things of that nature, but also the death penalty. And it's a major priority of the church here in Oklahoma. I'm sure you've all seen Archbishop Coakley in various columns and statements that he's made publicly, both in state publications and nationally. He's very outspoken on the issue because it's a real problem, especially in a state like Oklahoma. The governor talks a lot about being in the top 10 in the country of a lot of things, and this is one of those things we shouldn't be in the top 10 for. And so our goal, obviously, as we work to influence legislation, is to move things in the opposite direction. That's a monumental task. So before I get started, I'm going to keep my comments brief because I want to give some time for Q&A. That's an important interchange. I know you guys have some thoughts and questions you may have that you want to ask me about what's happening at the Capitol, so I want to reserve time for that. What I thought I would do is just give sort of a quick look back at what has happened and how we've gotten to where we are now, just a short look back into brief history. As you all know, in 2015, A.G. Pruitt instituted a moratorium on executions after the botched execution of Clayton Lockett. That was obviously gruesome and terrible under Governor Fallin, and what was revealed in that process as they looked back at what had happened was even worse. Wrong drugs, multiple attempts to inject him, and so on. And I won't get into the details, but it was not a pleasant experience. The state began looking into the protocol and what happened and what can we do to prevent that. While that look back was happening, we had a state question on the ballot in 2016 that passed, unfortunately, overwhelmingly by Oklahoma voters that essentially enshrined the death penalty in the state constitution. It gave the right to the legislature to determine whatever means they wanted, really, that was deemed by the Supreme Court as constitutional. So that includes the chair, that includes firing squad. I mean, anything that the U.S. Supreme Court says is okay, the state legislature can run with. So the state continued to review the process and what happened with the botched execution and determined ultimately maybe a more humane route would be the gas chamber. Because we've never seen that go wrong before in history, right? And so, won't go there, but they determined that would be the way to go. Asphyxiation, choking to death, would be a more humane way than being injected to death. Luckily, they couldn't find a supplier for the gas, so they had the chamber but not the gas. There are some humane companies out there that just didn't want to supply substances that are going to kill human beings. And so, after further review of that process, they decided, oh, this isn't a go. Maybe that botched process wasn't so bad after all. So fast forward to 2021, the state decided let's go ahead and begin this process again of doing the same thing that we were doing before that didn't work so well. Suddenly it's okay again. And as you all know, it resulted in the fight over Julius Jones and ultimately 25 other folks being lined up for execution, the first of which is lined up next week with Coddington. So it's been an unfortunate turn of events. So given my role at the legislature and working with members of the state legislature, I have the monumental task of convincing 100 red state Republicans that the death penalty is not a good idea. As you might imagine, it's not an easy task. But I will tell you that we're making a lot more progress than you would have expected, say, even 5 years ago. We had a meeting yesterday at the Capitol. Shane Claiborne was there with us. Some of the folks here in the room were there as well. The conversations that are being had with members on an individual or small group basis are very encouraging. So given everything that has been discouraging over the last few years, these conversations are encouraging. So Representative McDougall, if you all have seen his statements in the press, have been very encouraging. He has said on the record that if we can't guarantee we're not going to be executing innocent individuals, then maybe we ought to rethink whether we're doing this at all. That's a massive move forward based on what we've seen in the last few years. He has given permission to a lot of his Republican colleagues to begin to publicly question the process. And I will tell you in private conversations, and I'm talking about members of leadership in the House and in the Senate who won't say this publicly, but they tell me privately, I have real problems with the death penalty. I'm not ready to say it publicly, but I'm ready to start working on stuff. And that's been very, very encouraging. So we have a lot more progress moving forward than what you see in the public. And so what we're doing is we're in the process of putting these conversations together into a group, a coalition, if you will, both in the House and the Senate, to give these members permission to say these things publicly. Back in 2015, ahead of the state question, Eighth Amendment Project did a poll, and you guys may have seen this, where it essentially said there were two questions in the poll. The first question said, are you for or against the death penalty? As you might expect, the majority of Oklahomans said, I'm for the death penalty. I want to say it was 58%, something like that. Not a huge majority, but a fair majority. They then asked the second question. If you've got an option between the death penalty and life in prison, what are you favoring? Majority favored life in prison over the death penalty. What we've discovered since that time is that other polls that have been conducted around the country demonstrate that the more options you give people, the lower that number for supporting the death penalty gets, down into the 30s, which is huge. So we're going to redo that poll in November with the express goal of presenting that to legislators as they work their way into the session for 2023 to make the argument, look, this idea that you're going to lose an election because of the question of the death penalty and publicly questioning it is just a misnomer. You're not going to ever lose your election if you publicly question the death penalty. It isn't going to happen. What we also have found in polls is even more interesting. Not only do those numbers come down into the 30s, but when you ask people how strongly they support the death penalty, so if they're amongst those 30, okay, how do you rank the issues of all the issues out there? You know, jobs, health care, all the issues that you might expect people are interested in, the death penalty is barely in the top 10. So even when they're wholeheartedly in support of the death penalty, they're not deciding who they're going to vote for on that issue. So this is the message that we're trying to convey largely to Republicans who control the legislature in Oklahoma is you can say whatever you want about the death penalty, you're not going to lose your office. And that's been the big factor, whether it's members of the legislature, the governor, the attorney general, this idea that they're going to really get hit electorally if they don't support the death penalty is just wrong. And so as we're conveying this to them, and as you all are talking to your representatives and senators in the legislature, that's the message they need to hear. It's okay to talk about this. It's okay to question the protocol. When they hear this over and over again, they might actually start believing it. And so those are the conversations we're having now with members individually and as a group, and what we talked about yesterday. Next week, we're launching a group called Oklahoma Conservatives Concerned About the Death Penalty. And the express goal of this group is to say to Republican legislators, hey, it's safe to talk about this. We need to talk about this. We have executed innocent people. We know this. We might actually execute another one, depending on what happens with Richard Glossip. We don't know. But the fact that he's on death row at all is a problem. It's a real problem. What we went through with Julius Jones last year is a real problem. And so it's okay to question this from a conservative perspective. It has historically been a center-left issue. But there are conservative principles at play here as well. It's the question of innocence. It's the question of cost, right? All these things that are traditionally Republican principles, right? It's racial disparities, geographic disparities, economic disparities. All these things that we talk about can appeal to conservatives if they're given permission to think about it and talk about it. So that's what we're starting to do at the legislature, and we're gaining a lot of momentum. Representative McDougall told us, Adam and I were there, and Sue, who else? Herman, you were there as well. You heard him say this. He said, I think you've convinced me on the issue. He has said he's got a problem with the innocence factor, right? But we think we've got him there where he's willing to just say, you know what, it's time to repeal this thing. We cannot guarantee that we're not going to execute innocent people. If we can't guarantee, then why should we be doing it at all? So that's the conversation we're having at the legislature. And we expect a lot of progress in that conversation as members are coming to us saying, hey, I'd like to be a part of what you're doing, whether it's legislatively or just opening up the conversation to members. So I'm encouraged, despite what all has happened in the last few years, that things are going to move a lot faster than we think they will. And we're going to see a moratorium fairly soon. I'm generally an optimistic guy anyway. I'm dangerously optimistic because I know how the story ends. But I think we're closer to ultimately a repeal than we may think we are. So with all that said, I want to open up to questions if you all have any. Abe, go ahead.
Can you discuss how important is it for legislators to hear from their own constituents?
It's incredibly important, particularly those of you that are in Republican districts. If you're in a Democrat district, what's that? Right. Yeah, sorry. So the question was, how important is it to talk to your legislators, right? It's incredibly important. For the same reason that the polling question is incredibly important. They listen to constituents just like they listen to polls. So you need to be reaching out to your members because they respond. And the more personal that contact is, the more impactful it is. So a phone call is great, a letter is great, an email is great. If you walk down there and talk to them and say, hey, Representative Senator Smith, I got to tell you, I've got real problems with the death penalty, and here's why, and lay it out for them, especially if they're Republican, in conservative terms. It costs too much. We're executing innocent people, and so on and so forth. They'll listen to you. If you're earnest and diplomatic, they'll listen to you. They need to hear it more often because, again, you repeat things often enough, people are going to start paying attention. And so we've just got to be the squeaky wheel here, and they'll at least get the point that they need to start talking about it with their members. And so that's a good question.
I was just going to ask, how easy is it to actually get a meeting, a face-to-face meeting with a legislator?
So how easy is it to get a meeting with a legislator? Fairly easy, particularly this time of year. Now, between February and May, it's a little more difficult because they're jumping from committee meeting to committee meeting, so it's tough. But at the end of the day, they know who got them there. They have to at least give you some time because here are the statistics. Generally speaking, one person that calls or emails or writes a letter represents 100 constituents that would like to call but just doesn't have the time or they're intimidated or whatever. So they know that when you call and ask for a meeting, you got 100 people behind you that would love to do the same thing. And so that's pretty critical. So they're gonna make time for you. If they don't, let me know. I'll make time. I'll make sure you get time.
I don't know anything about this, but can you just call their office?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So all their contact information is listed on their respective sites. So okhouse.gov, oksenate.gov. You can pull up their name and all their information is there. Their assistant's name, their phone number, their address, their office number. It's really simple. Park in the south parking lot, walk in the visitor center. As long as you don't bring a gun in, you're good. And you can get in the office pretty quick. So, yes, ma'am.
I also learned that calling really early in the morning.
Yes.
When you're on the phone, if you call 7:30.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, so call times are critical too, especially during session. Just so if you want to take real critical notes here, committee meetings generally start about 10 o'clock during session and roll to the afternoon depending on what's going on. So if you catch them before, say, between 8 and 9 o'clock in the morning, it's a real good time to hit them, whether you're showing up or calling, because they're getting their day started. That's when they're paying attention. They've been on phone calls on the way in, and their synapses are firing, and so it's a good time to get them. Great point.
What is the pathway to vote for the penalty in Oklahoma given that the state question is passed?
That's a good question. So Adam can talk more about the executive path, and that's another path, a completely different path. Obviously, we have three branches. So, So what is the path to get to moratorium and ultimately repeal? So there's a legislative path, there's an executive path. I'm obviously more familiar with the legislative path. So the legislature has quite a bit of, I'll say, bandwidth to address the question despite the constitutional provisions. Particularly with respect to a moratorium, they can call for commissions. They can mandate the governor or the AG do something because at the end of the day, they control the purse strings. Okay, this is true for generally every legislature in the country. So they could, for instance, say, you know what, the Attorney General needs to look into this further, and we're not going to appropriate any more money until he does that. And there are, a dozen different options. Representative McDougall's looking at legislation that will establish a commission, an Innocence Commission, that will create a further layer of protection against those that have evidence that suggests innocence. And that's just one of the options we're looking at. I'll tell you, there's some things I can't talk about right now because I don't want to reveal them publicly, but we're looking at some options legislatively that could, let's say, throw some obstacles up in the process so it becomes more difficult simply just to declare an execution date. And so we're working behind the scenes to get those things in place, but they have a lot of authority to do those things outside of the executive branch. And that's why contacting them is so critical, because the more they hear from their constituents that this is a concern, the more likely they are to pay attention to it. So that's a great question. Father?
Question I have, following the budget in 2015 and that study that was commissioned, I understand it was 200-300 pages long.
Yes.
How much of the changes that were recommended took place?
Oh, that's a great question. So the question is, so there was the commission that to review the death penalty process after the botched execution, bipartisan commission. Governor Henry was among those members, and it was several dozen recommendations that they made to the process given all the problems that they found. My understanding is precisely 0 changes have been made based on those recommendations. So I'm glad you said that, Father. Actually, yesterday in our meeting with Representative McDougall and other members, he talked about establishing an interim study. So if you understand the process of how legislation is done, typically you'll have a question of concern about something that's going on in the state, and the legislature will call for an interim study. Generally happens this time of year, usually in the fall, and they'll bring in folks that have some expertise on the subject to testify on what's going on and what recommended changes can be made statutorily. He lamented yesterday that we don't have an interim study on the death penalty, but he wants to do one next year. When we do that, because we're going to do it, the commission's report is going to play a critical role in that interim study, because, I mean, who's going to ignore Governor Henry coming in and saying, here are all the problems we found in the process, and why are we ignoring these recommendations? I mean, this is a government commission, a state government commission, and nothing's been done. So those are going to play a central role in that interim study. Our job this year, in this coming session, is to kind of lay the groundwork for that conversation so that when we have the interim study, more members will play a role in that, and they'll pay attention to the conversations that are had in that interim study. So it's going to be, I think it's going to be a headline study that will be done, and the commission's findings will be key to that. So great question.
Last question.
Last question, yes.
How many innocent people have been wrongfully executed in the United States? And,
How many innocent people have been wrongfully executed? That's a great question. We know how many people have been exonerated. I don't know that we can say how many have been executed. I mean, Abe can address it. Yeah, I mean, it's far too many, I think, is the answer. More than 0 is too many.
I agree.
So
But I heard it was like over 150.
that's egregious. Abe, do you know the number?
What's the last question?
She said 150 is what she had heard that had been executed that were innocent.
Well, the problem with executed and innocent is that you can't get a new trial after
Right.
you're dead, right? So
Right.
there's very little proof, or very few cases where there's actual proof. However, if you look at the Death Penalty Information Center webpage, there's a section on innocence. They've now labeled 190 people as exonerated and freed from death row. Then they have a whole secondary set of people who took what's called an Alford plea, and there's several other methods of that, where basically they say your conviction's been thrown out, and they say, you can go home right now or face retrial. If you go home right now, it means that you're going to plead to a lesser offense unless you go on time served. But then you're not exonerated, you can't get any compensation, anything like that. In that section, they also have a list of people who were executed and thought to possibly be innocent. So that's where you can look to find what we know. Okay? We can all make our own assumptions, and we can also look at broader data that's out there. But for us in the movement, what the most important thing about our facts and figures is that we're accurate, and that we're not giving people information that we don't know. And if we say, if we don't know, that we say, I don't know, I'll get back to you, instead of making something up or making suppositions.
100%.
Brett, thank you so much.
Thank you.